there are obviously other things that we can do. A lot of the stuff that we can do in terms of impacting our health is related to the diet, right? And that is because 1 in 5 deaths are related to poor diet, right? And that obviously encompasses the developing world as well, which, that's unfortunately a lot to do with a lack of quality nutrition, a lack of nutrition in general. But then also, this is not just a problem of the developing world, it's a problem of the developed world in terms of basically the opposite end of the spectrum, in terms of a lot of people are dying from diseases related to overconsumption, right? So our dietary approach has to take that into account. We basically want to eat a calorie sufficient diet, or a calorie appropriate diet is what we often say. And that obviously is dependent on your specific goals. Generally speaking, it's probably going to be somewhat cyclical in terms of your calorie intake. There's going to be periods of time where, you're in a bit of a deficit. There's going to be periods of time where you're at maintenance. There's going to be periods of time where you're eating in a surplus. We basically want, if we were just purely focused on health, we probably want to eat a really good foundational diet, and then just, barely tweak the calories depending on our exact goals and also our exact, situation, right? So what I mean by that is, for example, if you are someone that needs to lose a little bit of weight, we're probably not going into this like huge crash diet, unless obviously, it's medically advised. Like, you could go on like an 800-calorie diet to get better, like, liver function, pancreas function, whatever, right? But in general, we probably just want to, create a diet that we can see ourselves doing for the rest of our lives, right? And that obviously wants to include, or should include, a few foundational dietary habits in terms of eating enough fruit and veg. And you can start at that, generic 5 a day. That's fantastic. You're at least getting some of your fruit and veg in. But we would probably be advocates of eating more fruit and veg than that, right? And that covers a lot of your bases in terms of, first of all, you're getting a lot more antioxidants in the diet, which are great for a variety of health issues. But also you're getting more fiber in the diet, which is great for, like, colorectal cancer. It's great for, blood sugar management, we could say. It's great for, again, a variety of things in the diet. It's also great for heart disease risk, because fiber potentially, depending on the type of fiber it is, etc., potentially lowers cholesterol levels in the body. So happy days. We've just affected a few different pathways that could potentially kill us, right? So we've positively affected them, I should say. Then also, on top of eating, fruit and veg, we want to eat, again, sufficient protein. That's going to help us with our muscle building goals, our strength building goals, our general health goals. What else would you say in terms of like main key habits with the diet? Again, we've got calorie appropriateness, eating enough fiber, eating enough protein. The next thing I would probably say is just, keeping saturated fat below 15%. Like, ideally, if we're talking like general population, we would say 10%. But, if you're exercising, if you are eating enough fiber, you probably do have a little bit of leeway with that. However, the general recommendations would be below 10%. So again, if we're talking population wide, as this episode kind of is, I'm going to say 10%. What else would we do with the diet, Gary, to potentially, just cover all our bases?
Did you mention salt?
I didn't mention sauce, no.
Yes. So sauce or salt?
Salts.
Yeah, and sauce. Salt, yeah, is definitely a big one. Particularly, like, if you look at certain populations, particularly Asian populations, where they have extremely high salt intake, you do see a very significant risk of gastric cancer or stomach cancer. So that's a fairly big thing. It's very difficult, to be fair, for people to be consuming like a massive excess of salt to the extent seen in some of those populations. But if you're eating lots of processed foods, you'd be surprised how much salt you can actually rack up. So salt is definitely something that is worth trying to reduce in the diet. The good thing is, like, we don't have to end up speaking to our clients very frequently about this if they're already eating a diet that's primarily whole foods. If you're following the other guidelines where you're eating whole grains, you're cooking your potatoes, you're cooking rice, you're having, fruits and vegetables, lean meats, etc. If you're doing all that and you're not adding loads of salt at mealtime, you're probably fine. The real issue with salt tends to be that the vast majority in the developed world tends to be added, or not added, but come through processed foods. So for example, if you get a sandwich in the shop, if you were having that sandwich at home, it might have had, half a gram to a gram of salt. Whereas if you're getting it in the shop, in Tesco or whatever, a prepackaged sandwich, you could be getting 3 grams plus of salt. And that's really taking up a large proportion of your daily intake / limit. And that can lead to quite a high salt intake over time. Other things that would add to that very easily would be things like eating crisps, for example, or bags of popcorn, things that even might seem fairly appropriate from a calorie perspective, but are really racking up your salt intake over time. So even if you just had, a bag of crisps or a bag of popcorn that's 100 to 150 calories or something like that, doesn't seem like a lot, but it could have a couple of grams of salt that could very easily push you over your targets for the day. So gastric cancer is one that's generally at higher salt intakes, but blood pressure can also be significantly affected by salt intake. And that can then lead to things like heart failure or stroke risk, which are definitely worth trying to avoid if you're trying to maximize your longevity. So the biggest thing there for me anyway is eat a whole food diet, follow the general guidelines surrounding a healthy diet, and you'll be fine. If you are eating on the go a lot, do have a look at the packaging, just see what the salt intake is like. But I find that most people can control this pretty well by eating mostly food that they're cooking themselves, not adding too much salt. To be honest, if you're an athlete and you're eating a primarily whole foods diet, it's no big deal adding salt to your meals. Sometimes you might even need it to enhance your performance. And there's some difference there in terms of how much salt people lose through sweat as well. And that's actually one of the benefits of exercise, is that you lose salt through your sweat. So that can actually, be a beneficial thing. You don't want to replace it all or overcompensate if you're trying to exercise just for health. But yeah, there'd be some guidelines on salt anyway.
Yeah, not further to that, like we do also have to consider like potassium and magnesium.
Sure, yeah.
Again, these are taken care of if you're eating a whole food diet. Like if you're not eating a whole food diet, like the requirements for like potassium, I think it's like 15 grams in like ancestral populations. Now, I don't think the actual recommendations in this day and age are 15 grams. I actually couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but we're still not consuming enough potassium, especially by comparison to the amount of sodium that's being consumed, right? But on top of that, magnesium is also something that people are not eating enough of. However, you actually don't have to focus on this too much if you're just eating like real food. Like you get a lot of magnesium from like green leafy vegetables in general. Same with potassium, you're getting a lot of it from vegetables, especially if you're eating like, tubers and stuff like that, like potatoes, that kind of stuff, squashes, whatever. So again, if you just eat a quote unquote real diet, like a lot of this stuff is just looked after, right? And one of the things I do want to say is a lot of people get lost in the weeds with this stuff, and they're really hyper focused on like reducing their salt intake, and then all of a sudden they're somewhat deficient in it because they're exercising. They don't realize that, again, like I said, you do lose some salt in your sweat, right? Like I've had a few clients, especially vegetarian clients, who end up finding that they're cramping up more often, finding that they just don't have that kind of drive anymore because they're not eating enough salt, right? And you just get them to salt a little bit of their food, all of a sudden, boom, they feel great again. One of the other things we have to consider with that is, and it's a little bit less, it's a little bit more important in Europe versus America, is that America has like iodinized salt. A lot of European countries, I think the only European country is Switzerland that iodinized their salt. A lot of Europeans are just deficient in iodine, right? Because we also don't eat a lot of, again, depending on exactly where in Europe we're talking about, we don't eat a lot of like seafood products, right? So a lot of people can be deficient in iodine, which then leads to, thyroid issues, right? So again, that's just a little extra further thing. But if you're just cutting out salt completely, and especially if it's not iodinized salt, then all of a sudden you're losing a source of iodine. Now, I would probably be more of an advocate of just eating more seafood, eating some like, seaweeds and stuff, like, you get like sushi and stuff. I know, Gary, you don't like sushi, but you eat sushi, you get some seaweed, boom, you have some iodine, fantastic, happy days, right? But again, we just want to eat a generally well-balanced diet, and a lot of this stuff gets looked after, right? And there is another thing now that I'm just talking about seafood as well, as omega-3s, especially marine-derived omega-3s, are really important for health, and the vast majority of people just do not get enough. The vast majority of people just do not eat enough fish in general. So that is something that we should, ideally be eating, fatty fish 2, maybe 3 times per week. And if you're not able to do that because you don't like the taste, or you don't have the skills to be able to, cook that, or you don't want to cook that, or whatever, then probably we need to supplement with some sort of fish oil, right? Or you could say, if you want to get some like algal derived fish oil, you can get whatever that stuff is called. What is it called? the non-fish oil stuff, plankton, whatever the fuck it's called. You can get those kind of fish oils or fish oils, omega-3s, I should say, as well. So you have options with that. Now, again, that's something that I would consider a general health practice. Like I supplement with some fish oil every single day. Like I'm trying to get like 3 to 5 grams of fish oil or omega-3s, I should say, every single day. And there's a few things that are beneficial with that. The DHA is really beneficial for like brain health and brain development. Now, I actually don't know in terms of how beneficial this is in terms of a general population person. It is very beneficial for children and infants to consume enough DHA because their brain is still developing. But in terms of when you're already developed, like let's say for you're 25 and above, like your brain is probably as developed as it's going to get, right? So it's probably less important, the DHA component. It's probably more important as you age in terms of preventing cognitive decline. So we could say maybe we want to keep it topped up to at least a certain level. But EPA is, regardless of your life stage, that is really beneficial. It's especially really beneficial for helping with heart disease risk in terms of like lowering triglycerides, in terms of helping with a better like overall cholesterol balance. So even if you don't get enough DHA throughout your general adult life, I'm a little bit less concerned about that. But if you're not getting enough EPA, I'd be like, okay, well, we have actually an increased risk of cardiovascular disease in this population then, because they're not getting the beneficial fish oil here, or omega-3 here, I should say, because you can get it from other places than fish. So do you have any thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that personally I probably have salmon like definitely once a week, maybe twice a week some weeks, but I still supplement, because I'm not a big seafood guy, to be honest. And I think even like cooking methods, the source of your fish and everything, where does it come from, that can all contribute to variance in how much of the omega-3s you're getting from your fish intake. So while you should consume fish, oily fish in particular, for health, and I would encourage someone to probably consume more than I do. Like if I enjoyed sushi, like I would eat it more often, because there's additional benefits to be gotten there. But I supplement, so I have omega-3s that I just keep in the fridge, and I think I take 3 to 5 depending on how many other pills I'm taking in the morning, so I'll take something like that. And just a note there as well, you kind of mentioned it already, but if I'm taking 3 to 5 pills, that's 3 to 5 grams of fish oil. But then there's the specific omega-3s that I'm actually looking at as well. So if you're looking at supplements, just look for one that has a higher quantity, because sometimes what you'll see is you're taking 5 grams of fish oil, but you might only be getting 500 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA, because they're just filling the rest with filler, so the quality
That's really
does
important as well, because there's different types of fish oil that potentially are beneficial for health, and other ones that are just kind of less beneficial for health. Krill oil was what the one I was trying to say earlier on. I couldn't remember. It was like plankton or whatever. But krill oil, well, it is actually in phospholipid form. You'd have to take fucking grams of that shit to be able to get enough EPA or DHA to actually have a beneficial effect. So while it is more, we'll call it absorbable, and it gets into the tissues and stuff like in a kind of more beneficial way, like you have to end up spending fucking so much money to be able to get an effective dose of that. It's the same way people are like, oh, well, I want to get this like ethanol form of it. Like it's actually less important, right? Because we actually just want to get an effective dose. I would actually go on to something like labdoor.com, because they actually have like the ranking of different fish oil brands, and you can see what is actually in the pill versus what they claim to be in the pill. That's an important thing to know. But then also in terms of like the actual quality of it, because fish oil can be oxidized, and unfortunately a lot of these ones, which is not great, a lot of these ones that you're like, oh, this is a great dose of it, it's actually just fucking oxidized, which is not what you want, right? So you have to kind of play off the risk to reward, the benefit stuff, because I don't think oxidized fish oil is going to be beneficial for health. And actually, in actual fact, I think it would probably be negative towards your health. So I would be looking to spend a little bit more money on getting a good fish oil brand. Again, go onto labdoor.com, and you can find the different brands, and you can be like, okay, well, what am I getting versus what they say they're giving me on the label, and then find that kind of risk to reward for you in terms of, okay, this one costs too much, it's outside of your budget, you're not willing to spend that every single day, whereas this one is a little bit less, a little bit lower quality, but it's inside your budget, fine, right? You just have to kind of play off that risk to reward benefit. There are some brands out there that are actually really, really fucking good in terms of like they'll have like a specific EPA only. You can get literally just the subfraction of EPA in triglyceride form, which is probably the form that I would recommend, even though I know everyone is like, oh, we'll get this like ethanol form and everything. I'm like, look, that's more easily oxidized both outside the body and inside the body. I'd rather just have it in triglyceride form. But unfortunately, if it is in triglyceride form, there are other components of that kind of glycerol backbone, etc. Anyway, we don't need to get into that. So go on to labdoor.com, see if your brand is any good. And if it's not, switch out to a better brand. And again, like I already said, like I'm taking like 3 to 5 grams. Well, I'm actually taking, I know exactly, I'm taking like 3 grams of actual omega-3s with usually about 25% spread to DHA and 75% towards EPA. Now, I do have ADHD. DHA is actually beneficial for ADHD. So I actually don't mind getting a little bit more DHA in the diet. But if I wasn't and I was only thinking about heart disease risk, I'd be just prioritizing EPA, because for some people, DHA does actually raise their triglycerides, which is, converse to what most people want in terms of, general health. But again, it's the risk to reward stuff there with that. We actually might do an episode on just fish oils in general. But anyway, that's it for now. But I will also say that I personally consume like 3 to 4 servings of fish per week. Generally speaking, I do have some sort of fish. Like I know we usually have like salmon, some sort of salmon dish at least once per week. And then generally, if we're out and about, I'll probably get sushi somewhere. If we're out and about and I'm like, oh, I want to get something for lunch, I'll probably get some sort of like salmon and cream cheese sandwich or something. Like I just enjoy fish, and I know I said salmon like fucking 4 times there, but other fish as well, like especially cold water fatty fish, like I like fish, so I eat it enough throughout the week to kind of ensure that I am getting enough omega-3s throughout the week, which is again a benefit of fats in terms of you don't need to consume them every single day. Like your body does store them. It's not like, protein, although you do store protein in the form of muscles and in your, your amino acids in your general like stomach cavity. But you can kind of store fatty acids for longer.
Check. Yeah, that's omega-3s. I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Anything else with the diet that we're considering? So we've got, again, we're eating enough fiber. We're reducing our saturated fat intake. Maybe you want to talk about saturated fat a little bit more. We're eating sufficient protein. We're eating a sufficient calorie diet. We're getting our omega-3s. Anything else with the diet? Like obviously, again, like we could spend all day here thinking, oh, this is the exact thing we're doing. This is, potentially beneficial here. But we're generally just eating enough fruit and veg that covers a lot of our bases. We're eating some, good quality meats that again covers a lot of our bases. Like, yeah, we could go into like, oh, you want to consume organ meats, you want to get some liver in there, has a lot of like, choline, it has a lot of these other beneficial, whatever. But I don't think we need to go too much down the rabbit hole with that. But do you want to say anything else on that? Or do you want to talk a little bit more about saturated fat?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I suppose that would be a specific component of the food matrix would be things like polyphenols. If you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables, you're probably taking care of this, But in particular, dark berries, like blueberries or dark chocolate as well. It's typically like those kind of richer foods that are naturally rich in color / flavor. They're the things that tend to contribute a lot to your polyphenol content. Also things like olive oil and lots of other fruits. Okay, so polyphenol content in particular for Alzheimer's / cognitive decline long term is something that is a good idea. You'll hear sometimes people from the kind of ancestral keto community being like, oh, these polyphenols are not essential. But the reality is that, like, when we're thinking about these questions of Alzheimer's disease risk long term, for example, we're thinking really about like optimizing. Like that's what we're doing. We're saying, how can we preserve our cognitive function into late life? So when you're thinking about like what's essential in the diet, you're thinking about like what's required to just keep me alive, keep me ticking over. But that's not what we're aiming at. We're aiming at living long and being able to preserve our quality of life long term as well.